Mhm. All right, good morning. Anyone else enjoying this beautiful weather? I love the rain. I know that like I'm in the minority. And usually when it rains, everyone's all sad. I'm like, oh, we don't get nearly enough of it. I just checked. I'm like, if the sun came out, like, how dare you? It's supposed to rain all day, but it's supposed to start at 9:30 again. So I'll take that. I'll wait for it. Everyone have a good weekend. Lots of good football. Now we're down to four teams, so not very many games left to go. That was a close game, right? I thought the Packers were. I like that was it was closer than I thought it would be. Yeah, but they're gonna go on. They play the Ravens then, right? This next weekend. You're like, I don't know. That means my dad, right? The Ravens. We'll see. I like Mahomes and the Chiefs one, so that's exciting, right? At this point, I'm just excited that there's still football on for a little bit longer. Not too much longer. My kids are like, 2 more weeks. Like, chocolate. So I'm not going to take attendance anymore. I'm going to pass around the sheets. Looks like this. I just printed it. So if your name isn't on here, you're not enrolled in the class. So make sure you double check with me so we can find out what's going on. If there's any like changes you want to make to your name, write it on here and I'll update it for next week. So go ahead and put anything on there. You can write your name or you can do your initials. You'll sign in each day. It's not worth points, but it helps me keep track of who's here. So please try to make sure everybody gets it if you can. And then when it ends, you can either just put it on the desk or up on my desk. And then that'll be how I keep track. So we don't have to take attendance anymore, which is nice. And then we get into chapter 2 today. So we have chapter 2 and 3 continuing to set the stage before we get to the actual disorders. So we're going to build on what we talked about by now talking about the different ways that we can view abnormal behavior. Okay, so we talked about how we viewed it in the past and some like current trends, and now we're going to go into the different models. And if you've taken any intro psych class or like psych classes at this level, it's a lot of these models. It's a lot of like going over the different ways that you can view behavior. But in our purpose, we're going to look at how it shapes abnormal behavior. So we'll introduce these and then you'll see them again all semester. As we get into the actual disorders, we'll talk about which models best explain that disorder and then dictate treatment and so on. But we have tons of these. We have lots of different models or theories or paradigms or lenses, all kind of synonymous words. Models are these sets of assumptions that help us to explain and interpret something. And in our case, it's abnormal behavior and mental illness. So they're going to spell out some basic assumptions. They set guidelines for investigation and treatment. It's just a way of viewing something, right? So we can view abnormal behavior through a model of like biology and look at physical causes, or we can view it through a model of like psychoanalysis and look at unconscious causes. And so there's a bunch of these as we go through, and some models are going to fit some disorders better than others. And so again, as we get to the disorders, you'll see these again. So we're kind of introducing them and some of their big ideas, and then you'll see them all semester long. Not only do they kind of explain the disorders, but they also dictate treatment, right? So if we think something has physical causes, then we're going to look at physical treatments. If we think something has mental or cognitive causes, we're going to look at mental or cognitive treatments. So they kind of spell out what causes something and how we're going to approach it. You can think about them just kind of like a lens to view abnormal behavior through. And as we go through each one, what I'll do is write a couple of like key terms for it up on the board, just to try to help you keep them straight, because they clash with each other. Some of them overlap, some of them clash, but we'll go through all of them a little bit, starting with the biological or medical model. So I'm going to write over here, medical model. This lens or this model, the basic idea is that things have physical causes. So mental illness is caused by something physical or medical or biological. It's kind of in the name, right? It's caused by something biological and physical. So some of the big things here are anatomy and chemistry, genetics, maybe even viral infections. So we're looking at some of like the big contributors, and then we'll look at some of the big treatments. Brain anatomy is one of them, right? Sometimes people have an issue with their brain anatomy, different brain circuits we'll talk about a lot when we get to depression, right? How different structures in the brain might be interacting with each other in a way that creates a mental illness. It might be a damage to a certain part of the brain that may or may not be repairable depending on the region. So brain anatomy is one, but the biggest one is probably the second bullet group, brain chemistry. How many of you, I think maybe you even had to, how many of you have taken intro psych? By show of hands. Okay. So I believe it's like a suggested prereq, but not required, right? Almost all of you. Brain chemistry is huge when it comes to mental illness. Neurotransmitters play a huge role in contributing to people struggling with mental illness. Can anyone give me an example of a neurotransmitter? Anyone know one off the top of your head? There's a bunch of them. Yeah. Dopamine, great. Really big one, right? Yeah. Serotonin. Anyone have another one? Those are the two big ones. Right? Dopamine, serotonin. Norepinephrine, right? I love it. Teamwork. We got it together. Norepinephrine, glutamate, GABA. Did I steal yours? Acetylcholine, right? There's a bunch of them. And these different neurotransmitters can affect our brain chemistry and how we function, right? These we use a lot of medications to help alter. And just as like a quick review, and again, I think I told you before, I'm a horrible artist, but I'm going to draw a little neuron up here. So here are the little dendrites. If I stop here, that's not too bad, right? Okay. And we'll keep going this way. And then here will be the end of the neuron, little terminal buttons. And then there's another beautiful one that I drew back here that you just can't see. It's such a shame that you can't see my beautiful piece of art right there. It could be worse, sorry, a little cell body in the middle. Right, so if you remember back to intro psych, right, when we communicate in our body, right, we use electrochemical impulses. And the first part is that electrical piece. So we have these little ions that are inside and outside of a cell or of a neuron. And whenever we have like any kind of communication that needs to occur, little gates open through a very high-tech process I'm doing here. Little gates open up, they flood in and out, causing an electrical change to happen on this neuron. Now it starts with that electrical piece, and then the neurotransmitters are the chemical piece. When it reaches the end of the neuron, it releases these little neurotransmitters that float across the synapse, a small gap between two neurons, and they keep that message going. So if somebody has too much of a neurotransmitter or not enough of a neurotransmitter, it can cause changes in behavior, hallucinations, odd thoughts, depression, anxiety, all these different disorders that we're going to talk about. So neurotransmitters are probably one of the biggest culprits, period, when it comes to mental illness, but definitely within this model. I mentioned brain circuits earlier. We'll get to those a little bit later. Yeah, sorry. It's Monday. Yeah.
Transmitters being chemicals and so like experiencing depression, right? Okay, let's just like a personality disorder, because those don't always necessarily have to be caused, right? It has to be something more physical. So that can be something like, for example, I don't know, or like the amygdala. Like if somebody has something wrong with their amygdala, like that cause more likelihood of something more, I guess, like I don't want to say like more, I guess, or like than just having something wrong with the chemicals. Because like I feel like the personality is very much built into who you are, and it's not necessarily just chemicals that you have or don't have. So like those be more something like a structure is being kind of
sure. So we'll get to, sorry, no, I think I follow you, right? So our personalities are definitely everything about who we are. It's kind of a definition. And we'll talk about personality disorders. I think it's chapter 13, but they're very complicated, not only in their presentation, but also their causes. So when it comes to what causes them, it's thought to be kind of like everything. It's like this combination of everything building on what came before. So your genetics dictates your chemistry, which dictates your nurture, and then like it goes on and on and on. So things like that might be shaped by things like the amygdala and neurotransmitters, but lots of other stuff as well, usually life events and conditioning. Personality disorders are really complex. So when we get to them, we'll talk about how it's kind of everything that builds. So yeah, it's not always going to be just as something simple as chemistry. Right? Sometimes people suffer from depression because of a life event or negative thinking patterns. But from this model, we could say it's something like chemistry or anatomy, like the amygdala or something like that as well. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts or questions for now? Genetics is another big one in this category. A lot of disorders have a genetic component to them, right? It doesn't mean you're doomed to get it, but you might be more vulnerable than the average person. So things like bipolar disorder, for example, it's like a 27% likelihood if a biological parent has it, that you might get it. So genetics would fall into physical causes, things that are like within the body. And then some viral infections, especially during pregnancy, like prenatal viral infections, have some correlates to things like schizophrenia and vulnerabilities to other mental illnesses as well. So the idea is from this one model, we're looking at physical things that cause mental illnesses to occur. So if we believe it's physical, whether it's anatomy or chemistry or genetics or whatnot, then we're going to look at physical treatments. So the models spell out what causes it and how we're going to treat it. And so from this perspective, the biggest treatment by far would be medication, right? If people have an imbalance of serotonin, for example, which is a really big culprit in things like depression, right? What we can do is give them a medication to increase serotonin, right? Rather than have it be all sucked back up into this neuron, we can give someone what's called an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and it causes more of that serotonin to be present, and then that person, in theory, would have less depression. Okay, so there's a medication for pretty much every neurotransmitter, right? We can affect those balances by giving people different drugs, and we'll talk about those different drugs all semester. In rare cases, or less common, I should say, we could consider things like brain stimulation methods, things like electroconvulsive therapy or transcranial magnetic stimulation, which we'll talk about later as well. These are things that are much more severe. Like if you went into a doctor with depression, they would never be like, all right, we're doing electroshock therapy. Like that's where we're going to start. Right? But they might give you a bunch of different medications. And let's say you don't respond to any of them and your depression is really severe. It's affecting your life. We might consider something a little more intense in your treatment, like a brain stimulation method. And these have been around a really, really long time. What we used to do is give people like a substance to cause them to lose consciousness. And then back in the early like 1900s, we decided to try an electrical current on a patient who had been struggling with schizophrenia. Can you imagine being this guinea pig, right? The first person to ever have electroconvulsive therapy. You're like, no, thank you. But in 1934, which I want to ask you, but in 1934, they took this patient who hadn't spoken a word in months, and they passed an electrical current, I wrote it down, of 55 amps through his brain for 2 seconds. He sat up, swore at the people who did it, said like, what the are you doing to me? And they considered it a great success because he spoke, right, for the first time in months. And so ever since then, we've kind of been refining this procedure, and it became something known as electroconvulsive therapy or shock therapy or electroshock therapy. What they do is they pass a current through your brain, and it's thought to activate some of those brain circuits related to depression. And it is something that's still used today, though we have some newer methods that we'll talk about in the mood disorder unit. But this would be like the next step from this model if somebody wasn't responding to medication. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. If you haven't, it's like an old Psych classic. You should probably watch it at some point. But there's a scene in there where they have an example of old electroshock therapy. I'd like to play it for you. Remember, it's just, and what they would do and what they did in that clip is they passed an electrical current through his brain to activate some different regions of the brain in those brain circuits for depression. And it's thought to almost like kickstart the brain in a way that reduces depression, but it can also cause things like amnesia. And people used to flail really badly. You notice they're all kind of pinning him down. But we've refined it a little bit. It is like an outpatient procedure, but it is still used. I was going to say it's shocking that it's still used, but good pun, bad pun, I don't know, one or the other. Really badly good, I don't know. But we do still use this today. It is still something that's practiced, but it would never be something that's done first. You would have a medication and lots of other options before exploring something like that. And even in more rare cases, we might consider something like a surgery if there's something in the brain that we can maybe operate on to relieve pressure or like repair in some way, if it's possible. Surgeries might even be considered from this perspective as well. So all physical causes dictating physical treatments from this biological perspective. Before we go to the next model, any like thoughts or comments or questions, anything about the biological model? Yeah.
Do psychiatrists generally study the biological model?
Yeah, when they're in medical school, right? So psychiatrists have a medical degree. So when they're in medical school, they would very much be versed in this, right? So typically the person who's going to approach this would be like a psychiatrist or your family doctor. If you went to a medical doctor, they would look at it this way. Okay. Anybody else? Anything else for now? All right. Next model. Who's this guy? Freud, right? If it's got a cigar, it's Freud. Freud always carried a cigar. Funny thing, it's what killed him, right? Most famous psychologist of all couldn't curb his addiction to cigars, and he died of oral cancer of the mouth from smoking them for so many years, right?
Oral fixation, huh?
Oral fixation, right? The most famous psychologist was orally fixated. Really interesting fact, a lot of psychologists, their theories come from their experiences. They're very much shaped by their own lives. You see that a lot with famous therapists, very much the case with Freud. So that's Freud, Sigmund Freud. Sometimes called the father of psychology, right? Because he kind of shaped everything. His ideas, not the most grounded in reality and science, but everybody who came after him built on what he put out there. So we had to start somewhere. So oftentimes we kind of forgive some of his very like sexist, outdated ideas for that reason. But let's talk a little bit about Freud and the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic model. So we'll say psychodynamic. So Freud believed that mental illnesses are caused by things that are in the unconscious mind. Very like early childhood stuff. And then we could add sexual and aggressive urges. Really like colorful ideas in a sense, but Freud believed that things like the unconscious mind were huge contributors to mental illness. Now, I'm going to erase this real quick. I'm going to erase my beautiful neuron, not the one behind the slide. So Freud talked about something called the unconscious mind, right? And we usually use like the analogy or the metaphor of an iceberg. So that's my iceberg. Here's the water line. I feel like we should have a Titanic. That's my Titanic. Here's Jack at the front. So I'll just apologize now, right? Okay, so Titanic, iceberg, right? The reason we use an iceberg is you can only see the tip of it, right? There's this huge base that's under the water. And Freud said that what's under the water is the stuff that's unconscious. So what you can see, the tiny bit at the top, is the conscious mind. What you're aware of in any given moment. Right now, hopefully you're all conscious and awake, right? That would be your consciousness. What's just under the surface, right, would be stuff like the pre-conscious or the subconscious. Like you probably weren't thinking about what you had for breakfast until I mentioned it, right? Or how your shoes feel on your feet until I bring it up, right? Those are things that you can very easily get your attention to, but they're not on your mind. They're just below the level of awareness. The unconscious will be way down here. Stuff that's buried, stuff that happened when you were really little, like in early childhood, things that you aren't very aware of at any given moment. It might take a bit to access them. Anyone know where Freud said the unconscious could come out? There's like a couple of ways the unconscious could kind of surface. Yeah? Do you have a thought? No, that's okay. Anyone want to help him out? Anyone, any guesses? Yeah. Freudian slips, right? Freudian slips could very easily reveal the unconscious, right? So you say the wrong person's name, right? Freud would say they were on your mind. Right? Yeah, that's not a good one, especially in certain circumstances, right? I had a biology teacher when I was in community college who would always say orgasm instead of organism. Like it was cringy. It was so awful. Like he'd be like, this orgasm. And then he would always apologize, like, sorry, organism. Like, we're like, okay, we know what's on your mind, right? He'd say orgasm every time. It was so awkward. You say the wrong person's name, you forget an appointment, right? Those little like bubbling up of things that are in your unconscious mind. There's one more really big one though. Yeah.
Fixations that hot stage and a desire was not there's some sort of disruption with one of your desires leads to behavior that
you get fixated, right?
Echoes unconscious desire.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be one way. There's still one really big one though. Dreams, yeah, dreams and daydreams. But yes, that's true as well. So Freud said that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. That through dreams, your like hidden desires and wishes and urges would bubble up and come out. Now that they might be really disguised, then you have to kind of dig through that latent versus manifest content, but that they would come up in dreams. So Freud believed through his therapy that we have to access the unconscious mind, which is something that is very, very prominent, like in our early childhood days. So we have to go back through talking and hypnosis and a lot of talking and talking and talking to get to these early childhood things that can come out and access that unconscious mind to work through whatever it is that's going on. He's also very driven by like sexual instincts, a lot about like sex and aggression, talked about the libido and how it can manifest in different parts of our body, really like controversial ideas. But for our purposes, the unconscious and some of these like sexual aggressive urges, the roles that your parents had, right? Everything goes back to the mother with Freud, right? Everything's very like mom related, played a big role in his theories. And he talked a little bit about a couple of other things. One that's relevant to us is he talked about 3 forces of the personality. And I love this picture. I feel like it's very like visually depictive of them. But he talked about the id, the ego, and the superego. How these 3 different like forces could shape our personality. And if they're out of balance, this can cause mental illness, right? So if one's more dominant than the other, and if we look at them, right, the id is the part of us that's purely unconscious, like primal and unconscious. Not a single one of you is giving in to your id right now because your id is not well behaved, right? Your id is the part of you that wants what it wants it right now. I don't care about the consequences. My id would have me either like sleeping or eating way too many donuts right now. Like, I'm not sure, 50-50, right? Could go either way. If I skip this one for a moment, the superego is like the angel on your shoulder. If the id is the devil, the superego would be the angel, right? It's almost like your conscience in a way. Your ego ideal, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, right? Always the shoulds with your superego, right? It's kind of like the part of you that guides you and could be overly restrictive, causing things like guilt and anxiety. If you have an overly present id, it can cause a lot of like impulse issues or aggression or violence. The ego is the part in the middle that is dominated by reality. So it's kind of like the great compromiser, right? It's going to kind of mitigate the demands of the id and the superego and try and keep everything in balance. And Freud would say if you had too much of one extreme or the other, it could cause you problems. Right, so he had a lot of other theories that are super interesting, but this is the one that's probably most relevant to us. And it shaped a little bit of his ideas of therapy and treatment and stuff as well. Yeah, is that a hand?
You know, this is a little off topic. This is what would happen. So if you had too much of a dominant ism, you have a regression issue or stuff like that.
Or like impulse control issues, yeah.
What if you have too much of a dominant or super ego?
Typically you get a lot of guilt, right? Like I'm not doing the things I should be doing. It could lead to depression. Depression, anxiety, guilt would kind of be like the stuff that would typically happen, right? Like I should be doing better in school, and then you feel bad about yourself and it can lead to depression.
Okay, because it's like the idea.
Yeah, of like what I'm supposed to do, right? What I should do. Yeah, yeah.
Is this model still accepting or is it?
It's still very much taught, right? Because it shaped a lot of the ideas that came later, but it is pretty outdated in a way, right? People will still reference it and reference some of his ideas, but it's typically as like a starting place rather than the end result. So his thoughts are really interesting. Some of his therapy stuff is still very much used, but the theories that shaped it are definitely a little bit archaic in the sense that they're outdated and not really supported by science. But they led to everything that came with it. Before I talk about this, I have a little clip of free association that I want to share with you. Well, here, I'll introduce it and then I'll play the clip. From a Freudian therapy perspective, we have to access the unconscious mind, right? In order to work through whatever is going on, whatever brought you into therapy or whatever you're struggling with, we have to get to the unconscious mind. And you can do this in a couple of ways. One of them that Freud practiced pretty heavily was something called free association. Free association is fascinating, and you could totally do this on your own. I actually really like doing this if I have like the time to. You just open like a blank Word document and start typing and just see what comes out. And you don't censor anything. You just kind of write and write and write and write. It's almost like journaling in a sense. And his thought was that if you just kind of uncensored let everything out, you'll eventually get to something that's on your mind that you weren't aware was on your mind, right? Like something's bothering you and you don't know what it is. Just start talking or writing and don't censor it. And eventually you'll get there. Another way of doing this is to give people like a word association. And he did this a lot in his therapy where he would give someone a word and then you had to respond with the first word that comes to your mind, right? So like if he said mother, right, you would in theory have a word that pops up like instantly, right? And everyone might have a different word. It might take you longer or shorter depending on how loaded that word is for you. And then you would look at, are there words you got stuck on? Are there words you couldn't come up with something for? What are some of the associations that are present? And then we could kind of work through them. So I have an example of this. If you've seen the movie Skyfall, there's a scene in there of kind of free association with words, right? And you give me a word back and he gets stuck on Skyfall, right? And if you watch the movie, it's because Skyfall was something that was really loaded for him. And so he couldn't quickly come up with a word, right? And so Freud would say that one is really clearly important, and we're going to need to go and work through it, right? And working through it in Freudian therapy looks like just talking about it over and over again for a very long period of time. This is the therapy that started it all, right? Freud was the one in like conjunction with a few other people who created talk therapy, who created the idea of talking about things and hoping of making things better. But what he would do is have you lay on a couch. Again, Freud invented the idea of the couch, facing away from him, and you would just talk. You would just free associate and talk through anything that came up. And over time, we would kind of work through talking and trying to go back to childhood, the things that come up. It's a very, very long-winded type of therapy. It doesn't tend to be supported by insurance so much anymore because it's something where you would see this person like multiple times a week, right, for years, right? And typically therapy is something where if you're lucky, you go every week or maybe every other week. And it's not usually for like years and years and years. So it's a very long-winded type of therapy, but some of the ideas of it are used in other types of therapy that are a little more modern. And one of the other big ideas here is something called transference. And I can tell you, as someone who did like 1,500 plus hours as like a therapist intern, so sitting there as the therapist doing therapy, transference is very real. I used to like kind of roll my eyes at the thought of it. I'm like, oh, that's not really a thing, but it is. Transference is when you redirect feelings in your life onto your therapist, right? So maybe you're mad at your therapist, or you fall in love with your therapist, or you have like these feelings towards someone in your life. You're mad at your best friend, take it out on your therapist. You transfer those to the therapist, and they can sometimes have feelings back to you, which we call countertransference. Now, I had a client, this was years ago at this point, I had a client who out of nowhere started bringing me gifts constantly. Like he would bring me like food, which was so hard to turn down. You're not supposed to accept gifts as a therapist, but he'd bring me like desserts and like treats. And he brought me a cake once because he knew I liked cake. I apparently talked about cake too much. But he started bringing me things. He started kind of almost like being overly friendly on the point of like flirting with me during therapy. And I was like, you're barking up the wrong tree in like every possible way, but I like obviously didn't say that. But he called me once like 40 times in one day and left me a ton of messages. He was like obsessing over me, and it wasn't necessarily me. Okay, so we had to work through this, which was so awkward. Like then you have clients who are mad at you out of nowhere. I'll take the mad over the flirting any day. Like be mad at me, don't try and like do the other. That's just awkward, right? Like he would flirt with me and I'd be like, what are you doing, buddy? But anyway, but it came up like we were trying to work through these feelings and discover where they came from. He was in love with his best friend's girlfriend, who was completely forbidden to him in the way that I was forbidden to him as his therapist. And so he was transferring those feelings onto me. And the second we realized that, we were able to work through that, and it stopped, thank goodness, right? No more 40 phone call days or gifts. Sadly, no more cakes, right? But we were able to work through that. Transference from this perspective is so important. Let's say you have attachment related issues and you're working with a therapist and you start to attach to the therapist, right? That can actually be really diagnostically helpful. And we can use those things and the feelings the therapist has to work through issues that are going on. So from this perspective, transference is really important. And Freud paid a lot of attention to it. And it's something that in especially like longer term therapy happens quite a bit. If you have a relationship with your therapist, eventually you're going to kind of transfer feelings onto them. It's very, very common, whether it's like romantic feelings or like maternal, paternal feelings or anger, it happens quite a bit. So from this perspective, a lot of talking and working through. I have a clip I want to show you of this, and it's so bad, but I love it. I don't know why I love this clip, but it's so cheesy. It's old and it's grainy, but this is an old type of therapy. So I'm really selling it, right? It's like it's old, it's cheesy, it's bad, but you'll learn how to flirt in it, potentially. Okay. So I'm going to play this for you, and then we can talk about it after. But I think it's a good example of.
Because like I said, she really looked nothing like you. Besides, you don't wear glasses. The only other association I have to roses goes back to my childhood.
All right, I think that's enough. So I love with that, like as cheesy as it is, right? I love that he's free associating. He's sitting there and he's just kind of saying whatever comes out, whatever comes to mind. That's very much what that can look like. The fact that they looked at a dream, very, very Freudian, right? Freud believed a lot in dream analysis, as those were the royal road to the unconscious. So a lot of analyzing dreams and just kind of talking through things. What do you think of when you think of this, right? And kind of working through those issues. That's a great example of what that could look like, even if it is a little cheesy. And now you know how to flirt, right? Saddest popcorn ever, as a side note. It was like the tiniest popcorn, right? Like the big tub of popcorn at the movie theater. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, anything else with this before we leave Freud behind? So we have two so far, right? We've looked at like physical causes and then kind of like deep-rooted unconscious early childhood kind of stuff. Another very big model that we could talk about is the behavioral model. The behavioral model is going to look quite a bit at conditioning. and your experiences. It's stuff that's learned. Right, so we're looking at behaviors, things you've learned over time, things you've been conditioned to do, right? That our actions, both positive and negative or normal and abnormal, are largely determined by our experiences and what we've learned in our life. Really big model. It was another really different shift in perspective in the field. And from this model, there's two main types of conditioning. And I know you all said you took intro psych, so just a kind of quick review. Classical conditioning was the one that was coined by Ivan Pavlov with the dogs, right? Where he would ring a bell and present food, and the dog learned to salivate to the sound of the bell. It's a very like unconscious, passive type of learning where you don't even necessarily always realize that it's happening. But classical conditioning can lead to things like phobias and fears. People oftentimes will develop like anxiety responses or fears because they've been conditioned to do so. I have a colleague who got into a car accident and where she was injured, but okay, but she was young when it happened. And on the radio at the time that the accident happened was the song Eye of the Tiger, right? Whenever that song comes on, she feels like a surge of anxiety, almost like a panic attack, because she expects something bad to happen because something bad did happen through conditioning, right? And so we can oftentimes learn things like fears and anxieties, phobias, and so on through these associations that happen. Yeah.
How would that be a part of?
So if it's a big event, once could be all that you need, right? So in theory, most classical conditioning things require multiple like pairings, right? Like you ring the bell, present the food, ring the bell, present the food over and over again. But if it's a very dramatic reaction, sometimes it only takes once, right? So in my life, for example, I always talk about this in my intro psych class, my poor mother-in-law. So I've been married to my partner. I've been with my partner now 20 years, right, this year. 20 years, long time she's put up with me, right? I'd say the other way around, but I'm afraid to. No. Long time. But when we first met, her mom cooked the whole family this big old pot of chili, right? And I didn't know that this woman is an awful cook until now. I know this now, like very well. I've been conditioned very, very, very many times at this point. She has given me food poisoning more times than I can count on two hands in the last 20 years. Enough so that when she cooks, I'm like, that's funny. I just pretend I just push it around with my fork. My kids have even learned to like push it around with the fork and not eat it, right? What did she make like 2 weeks ago? She made hamburgers and she's like, I'm going to get fancy and make them Italian burgers. I'm like, please don't. Like, please no. Like, what's an Italian burger? She's like, I put a lot of spices in there. It was so awful. Awful. I took one bite. It was so bad. But years ago, she made chili. Right? And I ate a ton of it. It smelled good, tasted good. And I spent the whole night violently ill, right? So one incident, and 20 years later, I still don't eat chili, right? Because the second I smell it, I feel like I'm going to be sick, right? I get that like, I don't want it. Like it makes me feel lousy. So sometimes conditioning can take multiple events, and sometimes it can be one, right? But it can often lead to fears and phobias and so on. I have a little video of like his work. It's like 3 minutes, but I think it's a great little refresher. So I'll play it for you. But replace the dog and the bell with something like chili or something like a car accident. You can see how people would start to develop a relationship between two things that used to be unrelated. Okay, so just a couple of minute review.
Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, Just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed.
Okay, so just kind of a quick review of his idea, right? That he would ring this bell, present the food, and over time, the dog